Hillier, okay, Daryl Hillier is a former resident of Gander, presently living in St. John's, and has had a lifetime interest in Newfoundland and Labrador aviation history. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Memorial University of Newfoundland. His aviation articles have appeared in the Newfoundland Quarterly, the Canadian Aviation Historical Society Journal, and the American Aviation Historical Society Journal. He recently published North Atlantic Crossroads, the Royal Air Force Ferry Command Unit 1940 to 1946, which is available through his website, which is crossroadsoftheworld.ca. And it's also available through Cole's bookstores at the Avalon Mall and the Village Mall, and all of the usual websites such as Chapters Indigo and Amazon. I now pass the evening over to Daryl Hillier and his presentation, North Atlantic Crossroads, the Royal Air Force Ferry Command Unit, 1940 to 1946. Daryl, thank you.
All right, so you can hear me all right there, John?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, John, and thank you as well to the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society for inviting me to speak here this evening. And welcome as well to all those who've joined us. And so I'll jump right into it and start with the least interesting part, and that's a little bit about me and how I came to be interested in this topic. And if anybody heard I did a short little snippet on CBC Radio this morning, and I talked about some of my inspirations, and that would be my grandfather, who served in the Royal Navy in the First World War, and my two uncles who were in the Newfoundland Regiment, and of course my father, who was the family genealogist and historian. So I was sort of surrounded by this Newfoundland history and family history. But my interest in aviation history in particular began about 40 years ago when my family moved to Gander. Of course, it's the town, of course, is steeped in aviation history. And I was still in high school at the time, and I wasn't long there when I heard about this World War II B-17 bomber crash near the Trans-Canada Highway. And anyone in Gander would know this is the aircraft that's down by the Thomas Howe demonstration force today. So being curious teenagers, me and my buddies, we pedaled down to the highway and hiked through the woods to this crash site. And that got me really curious, and that curiosity led me to documenting other such sites around Gander and eventually all of Newfoundland and Labrador, and researching the stories behind these accidents. And that interest expanded to include Air Force operations in general, especially at Gander, but not exclusively. I was interested in Harmon Field and Goose Bay and Argentia, Torbay, and so on. And not only Ferry Command, but I was interested in American and Canadian operations as well. But just to clarify here, for those who are not aware, the question being, what was RAF Ferry Command? And I guess in a nutshell, RAF Ferry Command was responsible for delivering Canadian and American manufactured fighters and bombers across the North and South Atlantic and Pacific Oceans during the Second World War. They were delivered to their frontline Royal Air Force operational units. So basically it was a delivery service. And the service went through several different name changes. It started, oddly enough, as the Canadian Pacific Railways Air Service Department. Then it became what was known as the Atlantic Ferry Organization. And then in 1941, the Royal Air Force took over and it became RAF Ferry Command. And later it became the Royal Air Force Transport Command. But I'll refer to it mostly as the Ferry Service or just Ferry Command, just to avoid any confusion. And despite the name changes, its role didn't change. It was there to ferry aircraft overseas. And as John mentioned, I published a book, and which we launched at the North Atlantic Aviation Museum in July past. And I guess my inspiration for the book was that I was always intrigued by the level of effort that Ferry Command put into salvaging downed aircraft, but it just seemed to me that Ferry Command always sort of went that extra mile. And I guess it's, which is not unusual because their job was to get those aircraft overseas. So my initial intention from a book perspective was to tell the story of some of these accidents and salvage operations, but it became clear as well that the story would not be complete unless I got into and discussed the construction of the airport and the people that work there, the wireless section, and social activities and so on. So it really just evolved from there. I guess my book is more of a narrative history. There's not necessarily any thesis or argument as such. It's although I did have one objective, and that was to Ferry Command is delivered. So throughout the war, Ferry Command delivered about 10,000 aircraft, I think just a little over 9,000. And again, that was across the North and South Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So, but I hope to determine what percentage of those went through Gander. Because I know at times, with all due respect to my Gander friends, that sometimes people say that Ferry Command delivered 10,000 aircraft and all 10,000 went through Gander, but that's not quite correct. So I hope to determine what number went through Gander. So before I get into it, just a couple of acknowledgements. I do like to do that locally, and for my local acknowledgements, Linda White at Memorial University Archives, of course, staff at the rooms, Sandra Seward at the North Atlantic Aviation Museum in Gander, and the Jack Pinson with the Gander Airport Historical Society, Patty Penny, the Gander Heritage Trails, and Lisa Daly, Reverend James Reed, and longtime Gander residents, Dr. Peter Blackie and Eileen Elms. So I'll jump right into it here, and I just wanted to touch a little bit on the evolution of Gander itself. And just to be clear, that Gander was not built because of the war. In fact, construction began in the mid-1930s. And this is a time in the mid-1930s when aircraft technology was bringing commercial, as in passenger, transatlantic aviation closer to reality. And interest was spreading among European nations. And this compelled the British Commonwealth to act as well and to make plans for the future. And of course, those plans are going to include Newfoundland due to its location on the North Atlantic route, or the proposed air route. Of course, Newfoundland was on the Great Circle route, which is the shortest geographical air route from Eastern North America to Europe. So the first significant step occurred during the summer of 1935, when British officials arrived in Newfoundland to carry out aerial surveys for an aerodrome for an anticipated land plane service, as in using wheeled aircraft, and a base for fixed wing seaplanes, otherwise called flying boats. Here's an image of a flying boat at Botwood. I guess at the time, flying boats were the only aircraft that had the capability of crossing the Atlantic nonstop. They had the range, but the wheeled aircraft or land planes at the time, they didn't have the range to cross the Atlantic nonstop with a payload of passengers, but those aircraft were under development. And the second significant step occurred late in 1935 at the Ottawa Conference, when Newfoundland, the Irish Free State, Canada, and the UK all agreed to cooperate to establish a regular transatlantic service, first carrying mail and then passengers. And the first phase, as agreed at the Ottawa Conference as well, involved experimental flights using flying boats, as in the photograph here, operated by the British carrier Imperial Airways. And for this purpose, the seaport town of Botwood was selected. For the anticipated land plane service, a site was selected on the shores of Gander Lake and adjacent to the Newfoundland Railway. And groundwork at this site, the Gander site, which was initially called the Newfoundland Airport, began in 1936. In 1938, Newfoundland-born Captain Douglas Fraser landed a ski-equipped Fox-Moth aircraft at the airfield, and this became the first aircraft to land at the new airport. So by 1939, the key infrastructure at the Newfoundland Airport includes 4 paved runways and an administration building in the photograph here, which for all intents and purposes was a terminal with a control tower and staff accommodations. There was a lounge there as well, which one law enforcement official at the time referred to as nothing but an evil influence. There was also one hangar at Gander. And this is the hangar here. It was just referred to as a civil hangar, although later it was given the number hangar number 20. There was also wireless receiving and transmitting stations, which were roughly north and south of the airfield, and they were run by the British Air Ministry. The Newfoundland owned the airfield, although the UK shouldered the majority of the construction costs. So aerial activity just prior to World War II at Gander was very limited. There were mid-air refueling trials using Handley Page Harrow tankers, as in the photograph here. And these trials were carried out in conjunction with the flying boat operations out of Botwood. So it's interesting to note that some of the very first flight refueling trials were done here in Newfoundland and at Gander. There was also upper air meteorological data collection flights using the Foxmoth, which I was shown in the picture earlier, and the arrival by air of a couple of visitors from the United States. One of those visitors who arrived at Gander in 1939 was a gentleman named Charles Backman, and he was on a risky venture to deliver an aircraft to his native Sweden. And Backman became the very first to depart the airfield on a transatlantic flight, and he was never heard from again. And there was even less activity in the months after war broke out in 1939. And indeed, the airfield's future was very much in question. So this brings us to 1940. And at this time, the Newfoundland governor is complaining to the British Dominion's office that Newfoundland is largely undefended. Then the UK responds by allowing Canada to send a detachment of patrol bombers to Gander in June of 1940. And these patrol bombers carry out basically base protection, but mostly coastal patrols and anti-submarine patrols. And they arrive in June of 1940. And basically, this is the only aerial activity at Gander until later that year when the air ferry service arrives on the scene. So just a little background. In the war, British need aircraft to carry out its air war against Germany. And for this, of course, they looked to the United States and later Canada. So initially, as in before the air ferry service was established, the states had to be dismantled and shipped by sea and then reassembled on arrival. Of course, all this was very time consuming. So there had to be another solution. And enter, at this point, Lord Beaverbrook, the British Minister of Aircraft Production. And he spearheads a scheme to instead fly these aircraft overseas. And of course, Gander is the logical starting point due to its easternmost location in North America. So during November and December of 1940, there are 4 experimental delivery flights and a total of 25 Hudson bombers are safely delivered. Of course, it's a significant achievement because no one had really attempted to cross the Atlantic in winter time, this late in the year. Like navigation was the challenge. Of course, they navigated by the stars or celestial navigation. And of course, once you cross the Atlantic, you start crossing the Atlantic and you get to that point of no return, or sort of that imaginary line over the North Atlantic where you lack sufficient fuel to return to Gander. Well, you're committed to continue. And if you run into trouble, you're really in trouble. So in the photograph here, the center photograph again is Hudson bombers at Gander during the summer of 41 in front of the only hangar that was there at the time. And the 2 photos on the left and right are actually of the aircraft at Gander during the, I believe it's the 3rd delivery flight in December of 1940. So of course, as I mentioned, all these aircraft arrived safely, 25 aircraft are delivered, and the success of these flights ushers in a new and quicker method of transatlantic aircraft delivery. There was, however, one serious accident during the early experimental flights of November, December, which I'll touch on just briefly later. So the question now is that what did the successful flights of November, December mean for Gander moving forward? Well, simply put, it meant more ferry flights. But the challenge for Gander now was its limitations in terms of accommodations and hangar space. There was an inn, appropriately named the Eastbound Inn, and which was built in late 1940 specifically for the ferry service. And there was the one large hangar, which I showed you earlier. But that was now shared between the RCAF, because I mentioned the RCAF showed up in June of 1940. So they had to share that hangar with the RCAF. So the ferry service determined that what it really needed was its own sector on the base. They needed its own hangar and accommodations. So for this, a site was selected on the east side of the airfield and construction began. So by late 1941, most of the key buildings were completed and staff began to move over from the administration building and the Eastbound Inn, where some of them had set up their offices. So in this photo here, although it's a immediate post-war photo, it does give you the general layout of the, and it was fairly basic and compact, certainly compared to the Canadian side that developed, and of course when the Americans arrived as well. So the Ferry Command side was the smallest. There was two hangars there, as you can see. They were known as hangars number 21 and 22. And behind those, you see barracks buildings, and they were barracks A, B, and C. There was a mess hall, cold storage, and a water tower there as well. And as I mentioned, it was just the basic, very basic facilities. So a scheduled bus service would pick up personnel at the RAF unit, and they could travel over to the American side or the Canadian side if they wished to visit the post exchange or the military retail store, or go to the hospital or to attend churches and theaters. A little to the right of this photograph, and you can't see it, it's outside the photo, but a little bit to the right, and in the woods there was a piggery. I can touch on that later if anybody wishes to learn a bit more about it if we have time. But that piggery was established by the commanding officer of the Ferry Command there at Gander, Group Captain David Anderson. He set up a small piggery in 1942, and then he decided to expand in 1943. And but he needed someone to run that piggery. He just didn't have time. Obviously, he was more worried about running things at the unit, so he didn't have time to run a piggery. So he eventually convinced a gentleman from St. John's, a pig farmer from St. John's by the name of Joseph R. Smallwood, to go to Gander to run that piggery. And of course, yes, that is the Joseph R. Smallwood. This was also on the Ferry Command side, and this was the commanding officer's residence. It was nicknamed the Barn because of its design, and it was one of the few private residences at wartime Gander. A bit of a fancy place. And it was here that the commanding officer of the Royal Air Force entertained various dignitaries, including Charles de Gaulle and numerous American generals and other high-ranking officials and politicians. And there was a lengthy list that show up in the Ferry Command archives and their diary, daily diary. And that's where they stayed on their journey overseas. Of course, the whole area was, as the slide indicates, was named Beaverbrook Center, or Beaver Center for short, after Lord Beaverbrook. And one note of change, so this Ferry Command sector was completed in late 1941. And one change of note in 1941 as well saw the RCAF, the Canadians, assume complete control of the airfield for the duration of the war. Because up until April of 41, the airfield was still run by Newfoundland. But the RCAF took it over in April of 1941. And even though they controlled the airfield, Beaver Center, or Ferry Command at Gander, was given a certain degree of autonomy when it came to the developments of its works and buildings, although there was little further expansion from what you saw in the photo there. I just want to touch on some of the key unit personnel. And it was a mix of civilian and service personnel. Ferry Command was a bit of an oddity in that sense, because, as I mentioned, it started as the Canadian Pacific Railway Air Service Department. So it was a civilian organization. And even after the Royal Air Force took it over, it still retained that civilian aspect to it. And one of the gentlemen who worked at Gander during the war suggested to me that even though it was a mix of civilian and service personnel, he figured that about 80% were civilian. The aircraft maintenance section, which I focus on fairly extensively in my book, was exclusively civilian. And the men came mostly from Canada, but eventually from Newfoundland and Labrador as well. One gentleman who I correspond with fairly frequently was James Reed from Gander, and people in Gander would know him as Reverend Reed. And he went to Gander in 1942, he was from the Codroy Valley, took his toolbox, hopped on the train and went to Gander and found employment as an apprentice mechanic with the Ferry Command. One of the key characters at the unit was this gentleman here, and his name was John Joseph Joe Gilmore. Joe Gilmore was born in East Belfast, and he served in the Irish Army Air Corps as an aircraft mechanic. And in 1933, he made his country's first parachute descent. He was also a qualified pilot, and he was hired by the British carrier Imperial Airways as an aircraft engineer. And Imperial then transferred him to the ferry service in 1940, and the following year, 1941, he was sent to Gander as the chief maintenance engineer. And he became much respected by his staff and well known in rural Newfoundland, in central rural Newfoundland, for his medevac flights and his salvage operations. Another individual here is Newfoundlander Tom McGraw, and he was one of Gander's original airport staff. And he was a civilian airport operations officer in the early days. And when I say the early days, I mean before the first ferry flights and before the Canadians arrived and before the Canadians took over the airfield. And he was taken on by Ferry Command, mostly because of his unique understanding of transatlantic operations. And in time, he became the senior flight control officer or supervisor with the Transatlantic Air Traffic Control Unit. So he, along with a number of other civilian staff who held supervisory positions, were given special commissions called civilian component commissions. And he was given a commission, and basically this allowed people who were holding supervisory positions, this allowed them to carry out their duties as uniformed members of the Royal Air Force. So he was given a commission, and McGraw was given the rank of flight lieutenant and later was promoted to squadron leader. Another Newfoundlander who worked at the unit in Gander was John Murphy, and not the former mayor of St. John's. Although John was from St. John's, and I conversed and corresponded with John on a fairly regular basis. He passed away some years ago. And occasionally we get together when he visited from his retirement home in Arizona. And he went to Gander early in 1941, and he quickly found employment. He was only a teenager, actually, and he found employment with the ferry service as a confidential secretary to the unit's various managers and commanding officers. And he continued in this position until the unit closed in 1946. So up until mid-1941, and I mentioned like the ferry service was for all intents and purposes a civilian-run organization under the Canadian Pacific Railway. And but then the RAF took it over in mid-1941, and it became known as RAF Ferry Command. But the job remained the same, getting these aircraft overseas. But the service is now under a military umbrella as opposed to a civilian. And there's a change in management. To see the arrival of RAF officers to command the unit. In particular, the arrival of Group Captain David Anderson. And he becomes the longest serving commanding officer of the unit. Another interesting character, and I'll talk a little more about him later. So just for a bit of context here. So here's Gander circa 1943-44. I've identified the Ferry Command side, the sector on the bottom right. Of course, you see the RCAF sector there. To the right of that actually is the Canadian Army side, and then the American sector as well. So the American sector was expansive, was huge. There was about a dozen hangars there. So anybody who's, if you know Gander, where the American side is too, well, that's where the current terminal is too, and parking area, and 103 Search and Rescue and CFB Gander, that's that area there. So just for context, and I will point out too that on the ferry, if you look down on the Ferry Command sector as well, that's the two hangars I mentioned earlier that were built, hangars 21 and 22. And they are the only two original hangars left standing in Gander today. They're used by the Government Air Services for their water bombers. So I just want to just touch on what was called joint control. So when the entered the war in December of 1941, we see a major increase in aircraft deliveries through Gander, because the Air Force, or the Americans, of course, began to build up its air units in the United Kingdom. So the first major movement of American aircraft through Gander begins in the fall of 1942, but the US anticipate significantly increased delivery numbers in 1943. This comes with some major concerns. Of course, now the problem is that you have the Americans ferrying aircraft overseas and the British along basically the same routes. So coordination and cooperation becomes paramount, especially with regard to transatlantic air traffic control. So the end result, after a series of meetings between representatives of Ferry Command and the US ferrying service, they decide to establish joint US RAF transatlantic control centers to coordinate these deliveries. So the photo here is of the, it's not a very good one, but photos of the joint air traffic control center at Gander are very, very rare. But essentially the Americans and the RAF, they work side by side to help coordinate the delivery of these aircraft overseas. And in the photograph there, there's in the foreground, there's an American officer, and there's also an RAF officer there as well, who actually, I think the gentleman on the right in the foreground is a Newfoundland RAF officer. And in the background, there's another, and you see in the background is there's a gentleman standing on a ladder, and he's a Newfoundland civilian. So it's a real cosmopolitan mix here. And he's standing at what's called a movements board. So it's just a huge chalkboard where they're writing, they keep track of the aircraft that are going overseas. So they have the aircraft serial number, the captain's name, and it's the time of departure, and its estimated time of arrival. So this is how they track everything on this huge movements board. So so the control center guides these aircraft overseas until about halfway across, and they're taken over by their air traffic control counterparts in Prestwick in Scotland. So, as I mentioned, so what they did to this control center was actually in the hangar. In hangar 21, they basically added they remodeled the hangar 21 to accommodate this control center. But as part of the remodeling of the hangar, they also had the wireless section was also moved there. I mentioned the wireless section was north. The wireless transmitting and receiving sites were north and south of the airfield. So what they did is they set up the wireless section inside the hangar, but they were given remote access to the sites, the transmitting and receiving sites. So among the wireless staff inside the hangar were female civilian Morse code operators. And then also they, along with members of the Royal Air Force's Women's Auxiliary Air Force, handle coded messages from Dorval in Montreal, Prestwick, New York, and Foynes in Ireland. So I just wanted to touch a little bit out on some of the mishaps and salvage efforts that were handled by the unit. Some of them involved Newfoundlanders got involved in the salvage as well. So I just want to touch on a few stories here. And this is a crash of a Hudson bomber, and this was the ferry service's first major accident at Gander. I guess the first aircraft accident ever at Gander. And this occurred in December of 1940 during the fourth and final of the experimental formation flights. The aircraft crashed on takeoff and burned out, but the crew were very fortunate, to say the least, to escape the inferno. This one here, I'm sure many people are familiar to Sir Frederick Banting, and Sir Frederick Banting was killed in a crash, a ferry service crash in February of 1941, when the ferry service was really in its infancy, and it wasn't even called Ferry Command, and it was still Canadian Pacific Railway's Air Service Department. And the aircraft crashed just about 10 miles from Musgrave Harbor, and all but the pilot was killed. Banting did survive, but succumbed to his injuries the following day. And the story, of course, is of the crash. There's quite a few conspiracy theories surrounding the incident. And this is another Hudson bomber that crashed on the West Coast, and it force landed near the community of Codroy. And it's a good example of the effort made to salvage aircraft and to get the community involved as well. So the aircraft force landed on a hillside. The crew actually walked into Codroy, and the salvage team from Gander, headed by, of course, Joe Gilmore, who I mentioned, they hopped on the train, went to Codroy, and they went to the site by horse teams. They dismantled the engines and the wings and so on, and brought them out by horse-drawn sleigh. And then they hired community members to help drag that aircraft from the hillside into Codroy. And it took them quite a few days. They did about a mile or so a day until they got the aircraft into Codroy. And from Codroy in the spring, the aircraft was floated on the bay and placed aboard a ship and returned to Montreal. They didn't fool around. This is another crash, and this is what's called a Boston. It was a twin-engine medium bomber, and this is an aircraft that departed Gander in November of '42, and they got out over the Atlantic Ocean, and the aircraft started to ice up badly to the point where the pilot actually sent an SOS because he said there was no way they were going to survive. Well, obviously they did. They got back. He headed back to the coast, and tried to get back to Gander, and then eventually he saw an open field and some houses. He had no idea where he was to, and he forced landed in the community of Conch on the Northern Peninsula. And you can see how close he is to the community. You can see the houses in the background. And the wreckage, as you could tell, much of the wreckage, they did recover certain parts, but the majority of the wreckage is still there. And I think it's been designated as a municipal heritage site. And you can, I think there's a plaque there or a storyboard there that tells the story of the crash. This is a let's call it B-24 Liberator. And just to touch on, this is a Liberator was part of what was called the return ferry service. So as I mentioned, these pilots, they ferry these aircraft overseas, and of course they had to get back. So early in during the ferry service, and certainly late 1940 and early 1941, once they delivered their aircraft, well, the only way to get back to North America was by ship. So they had to find a quicker method, a quicker way of getting back to North America to pick up more aircraft for delivery. So the RAF decided to establish a return ferry service, which was operated by the British Overseas Airways Corporation. So these aircraft were basically converted. They were bombers, but they were converted for passengers to fly these ferry crews back to North America. And this particular aircraft was trying to land at Gander in February of 1943 in a bad snowstorm, circled the airport several times, and eventually ran out of fuel and just dropped from the sky. There were 21 people on board, including flight crew as well and passengers, and only 2 people survived. There were 19 killed in this particular incident. Certainly one of the worst accidents in this province during the Second World, probably the worst accident, and one of the worst accidents for the Royal Air Force Ferry Command as well. And here's another Hudson bomber, and it force landed in central Newfoundland. It was a bit of an unusual one because it took about 8 months to get this aircraft out of there. They actually brought in a bulldozer. They carved the aircraft was, the closest community was probably Howley. They brought a tractor in a bulldozer in by train and drove it overland several miles to the crash site and carved out a runway out of the bog and flew the aircraft out of there. I say it took 8 months because on their first attempt it crashed again, and they had to repair it, and eventually they flew it out, and it was flown back to Gander by a ferry pilot by the name of Lowell Thompson. A bit of a daredevil ferry pilot, to say the least. And I just wanted to show this just for an interesting perspective, and many people certainly wouldn't know this, but of course the site in 1942 was very remote, but it was somewhat close to the railway. Of course now you could still make out the remnants of that runway, which I've identified there. That was carved out in 1942, and that road running parallel is actually the Trans-Canada Highway. So you drive right by there, you'd never know. And ironically enough, out on that bog there, the same bog where the runway is to, is a VOR DME, which is navigational, ironically enough, navigational equipment for Deer Lake Airport. I mentioned earlier about Group Captain Anderson, and a bit of an intriguing character. And as I mentioned, he was the unit's longest serving commanding officer. There were a few others, but he was there the longest, and certainly probably the most interesting too. And he served in the RAF in the First World War. And between the wars, he flew with the RAF in India and Iraq. And in fact, while he was in Iraq, he was decorated by King Faisal, who was a friend and protege of T.E. Lawrence, of course better known as Lawrence of Arabia. After the Second World War started, he was transferred to the British Embassy in Washington. And then in 1942, he arrived at Gander with his wife to take command of the Ferry Command Unit. And Anderson and the aforementioned head of maintenance, Joe Gilmore, they were, I would suggest, probably the most popular figures at the unit, and certainly in nearby coastal communities, because when called upon by the Newfoundland government, they carried out numerous medevac flights, bringing people to hospital at Gander, or sometimes if the situation required, they would deliver a doctor right to the patient's doorstep. So on the topic of Commander Anderson, this sort of brings me to the last of the unit's wartime salvage operations. And this involved another Hudson bomber, which left Gander in December of 1944 for Montreal, carrying none other than Commander Anderson. And this was more of a personal flight and perhaps off the record, unauthorized, because the pilot had arranged to bring his wife to Gander for Christmas, and his wife was in Montreal. And he picked her up in Montreal. They left Montreal and flew to Maine in the United States, where they picked up Group Captain Anderson's son, who was attending boarding school there, and he was also going to Gander for Christmas. They set course for Gander, but couldn't land because poor weather had closed the airfield. And they circled around for a while, and they didn't think they could get to Goose Bay. They wouldn't have enough fuel to get to Goose Bay, so they decided they had no choice but to force land. And they forced landed in southern Newfoundland. Fortunately, there was no injuries, and damage to the aircraft was minimal. And the crew and the passengers were several days stranded in the Newfoundland wilderness before being located. They were rescued on Christmas Day in 1944 by Joe Gilmore, the head of maintenance, and he made several flights to the crash site and brought the castaways back to Gander. And so that's pictured the aircraft at the crash site, obviously they're under repair. Incidentally, the radio operator on this particular flight was a gentleman named Maxwell Hutchings, a Flight Lieutenant Maxwell Hutchings, and he actually was from Bell Island here in Newfoundland. So this was in December of 44. The following month, January, now we're back into January 1945, and that opened with the departure of Commanding Officer Anderson for a posting in Australia. Also in January of 1945, work began on salvaging his downed Hudson bomber. And it took about 6 weeks, and the undercarriage of the aircraft was fitted with skis, and the aircraft was flown to Gander, again by this ferry pilot named Lowell Thompson. And this is a picture of the Hudson bomber in front of that Ferry Command hangar with skis. I can't say I've ever seen many bombers with skis on it, but the Ferry Command unit, they salvage a few aircraft in this manner. So this sort of brings me up to the actual closure of the unit. So like I said, we're now into 1945 and the war is nearing an end, but aircraft continued to be ferried across the North Atlantic in significant numbers. Indeed, from January of 1945 to Japan's surrender in August, the unit serviced about 800 overseas aircraft deliveries. And then several months after the end of the war, negotiations began to return control of Gander to Newfoundland, because as I mentioned, the RCAF, the Canadians, took control of the airfield in April of 1941, and the agreement being that at the end of the war, cessation of hostilities, they would renegotiate or negotiate the control of Gander back to Newfoundland. And ultimately, Newfoundland resumed control of not only Ferry Command side, but the entire airfield, Ferry Command side, the American side, Canadian side, the entire airfield returned to Newfoundland's control on the 31st of March of 1946. On the Ferry Command side, these Canadian civilian Ferry Command employees, they turned in their passes, and many of them were flown to Montreal. Some did stay on to work at Gander with the Department of Civil Aviation, with the Newfoundland Department of Civil Aviation, because they were now responsible for Gander Airport. And I mentioned Tom McGraw earlier, Newfoundlander Tom McGraw, who worked with the Air Traffic Control Unit. And he, for example, returned to his old position as the airport operations officer. And others took positions with the various commercial airlines, which commenced passenger services immediately when the war ended. I mentioned again John Murphy from St. John's, who was the confidential secretary to all the commanding officers at the unit. Well, he went to work for TWA, and in fact, he worked for the company for 40 years. So I just wanted to touch on the commercial aviation aspect of it, because we're into this transitionary period now in 1945-46, when Gander moves from a military base to a commercial operation, and he eventually earns that title, the Crossroads of the world. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Gander was built for the purpose of supporting regular transatlantic commercial operations. So when the war ended in 1945, the commercial carriers like TWA and Pan Am, American Overseas, BOAC, they were all anxious to get started immediately with commercial operations. The problem in 1945, when the war ended, was that the airfield lacked a suitable air terminal and passenger accommodations certainly to handle the anticipated level of commercial activity. I showed the picture earlier of the administration building or air terminal, and just simply was not going to cut it for this level of commercial activity. But in the meantime, in 1945, the temporary arrangements were made using vacated U.S. barracks buildings for accommodations and a former U.S. hangar as a makeshift terminal. It was a temporary thing, but it dragged on for so long that the commercial airlines started to get pretty upset. Now, it also happened that just before the RAF unit closed in March of 1946, and when the airfield returned to Newfoundland's control, just before that happened, the resident RAF commanding officer, a gentleman by the name of Group Captain Botting, who was basically Anderson's replacement, he had prepared a report on airfield facilities, and the report he prepared for the Newfoundland government. And his intention was to make recommendations to the Newfoundland government on the airport's potential use for commercial aviation. And he reviewed basically the entire airfield, all the infrastructure on the American side, the Canadian side, and the RAF side. And he identified the Royal Air Force side as the best for handling civilian passenger aircraft, with the RAF barracks converted as passenger and aircrew accommodations. The other sectors of Gander Airfield, the American side, and where the Canadians were too, he suggested that they would be more useful as accommodations for the staff of all the various airlines, as I mentioned, TWA and Pan Am and so on. And ultimately, the Newfoundland government agreed with his suggestion, as did 8 airlines. And they agreed with his suggestion, and they signed a joint lease agreement. And they cost shared to have the former Ferry Command sector converted over for commercial operations. So, as I mentioned, so what they did, they converted the barracks. In the earlier picture, I showed three barracks buildings behind the hangars. They converted those to a hotel operation for passengers, quarters for flight crews and stewardesses, and resident apartments. And the 2 former Ferry Command hangars comprise the terminal area. And Hangar 22 in particular was converted to a passenger waiting area with airline ticket counters and the famous Big Dipper bar. And in the photograph here, you see that's the terminal, the old Ferry Command hangar converted to a terminal. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the ticket counters. On the left-hand side, I believe it's the little souvenir shop or the novelty booth, I believe it was called, where you could pick up your magazines or souvenirs of Newfoundland. And I mentioned the Big Dipper bar as well was there, sort of a famous Big Dipper bar, and there's the Big Dipper there. And it's reported to be, at the time, the only bar in Newfoundland that was open 24/7. So this is the terminal, and this terminal officially opened in September of 1946. And it was used until the current terminal opened in 1959. So essentially what they did was they built a terminal within the hangar. And as one of the auditors at the time said, it was, and described it correctly, really, was that it was a building built within a building. So it was a building within a building. And that's of course, that's the airport there, the terminal after it was just after it was opened in September of 1946. And again, that hangar still is one of the few, or the only, those 2 hangars on that side are the only ones still standing at Gander today. Lots of history there. So I just wanted to conclude, just a few concluding remarks. And I mentioned earlier that one of my objectives was to determine the number of aircraft that were ferried through Gander. And for this purpose, I consulted various sources, mainly some of the landing logs that recorded aircraft landings and departures. They're incomplete, but I did consult those. They do cover a period from 1940 to 41, and then they pick up again. There's a collection at the room's archives here that covered the period May of 43 up until war's end and beyond. And they are the landing logs actually for Ferry Command, so it worked out great for me. But there were still gaps, and I had to fill in those gaps with other documents, and such as reports, monthly reports that I got from the UK that were filed by Sir Frederick Bowhill, and Bowhill was the air officer commanding in chief of Ferry Command. And then there was the unit operations record book, or daily diary, basically. So I used those to fill in the blanks as well. And I determined that at the end that Ferry Command, they serviced about 4,000 aircraft during the Second World War at the Gander unit. And using the same sources plus American documents as well. I mentioned earlier about this joint air traffic control center that they established on the Ferry Command side to help coordinate the deliveries of Ferry Command and American aircraft. And that operated from May of 43 to May of 45. So that operated for 2 years. So I determined that the air traffic control unit at Gander, they handled about 7,500 US and so combined US and Ferry Command ferry flights out of Gander. So it's we're a pretty busy unit, to say the least. And that sort of concludes that little talk there. Hopefully it made sense. I can't hear you, John.
Thanks so much, Daryl. I'll just jump in. John, we can't hear you. I don't know if you were muted or, but we can probably get you to stop sharing your screen, and then maybe we can see the audience and if anybody has their hands up and for questions. Daryl, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
I can. I'm going to show one more slide there, Heidi.
Okay, yep.
I'll just, something I just added for people to look at. So, and as I mentioned, this is sort of a side project, and I mentioned I was trying to determine, and of course, there were quite a few Newfoundlanders that worked in ground support roles at Gander, as I mentioned. I mean, they're air traffic control and flight refuelers with Shell Oil. That's ground support. So, but I was curious to how many Newfoundlanders actually flew as air crew with Ferry Command, delivering aircraft around the world. And these are 9. I discovered a 10th and maybe even 11th as of today. So these gentlemen here all flew. They were Newfoundlanders who flew with Ferry Command, delivering aircraft around the world. The 3 gentlemen on the top are radio operators, and all those three Newfoundlanders were killed during ferry flights. And I direct you to the image on the bottom left. And the gentleman on the bottom left is Harry Pinson from Grand Falls, and he delivered aircraft across the North and South Atlantic and into Africa. And like I said, he's a Pinson from Grand Falls, and if you look a little closely at him, if he looks familiar, yes, it's Gordon Pinson's brother. Yeah. So yeah, that was. So if there's any questions.
There is one from Glenn who wants to know, given that there were probably hundreds of these planes constructed, why was there such an effort to retrieve downed aircraft?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and you know, their job, and I sometimes wonder the same thing, but their job was to get those aircraft over. I mean, it seemed like in some cases the Americans and Canadians might have abandoned these aircraft and just moved on. But Ferry Command, the aircraft were expensive, and I can only conclude that was their job. Their job was to get those aircraft over there. And it is amazing. They went through great lengths to salvage aircraft. And as I mentioned, you see the one in Codroy. That's just one, you know, that's just one of a few. But that was their job. Their job was to get those aircraft over. If they're not, now don't get me wrong, in some cases the aircraft were abandoned, they were left there. But if there was an opportunity to salvage an aircraft in whole or in part, they did it. Right? I think it basically is because that was their job, was to get those aircraft over there.
And Percy would like to know if there were any instances of sabotage at the airport.
There was. I'm going to say no. There is a story, and I tell it in my book, that there was a B-25, a twin-engine medium bomber that went into Gander, and there was a concern that there was cork put in one of the fuel lines, and the problem there was that these aircraft as well, certainly some of the medium bombers, they did not have the range to cross the Atlantic. They had to have extra fuel tanks installed in their bomb bays. That's the only way they could cross. And so the concern here was that this piece of cork that was inserted into the fuel line, well, it was going to create an airlock. So they might get halfway across the Atlantic and switch over to another fuel tank. And next thing you know, there's an airlock there because of this piece of cork. That was one incident where, but they never really did in fact, the RCMP were brought in from the criminal investigation division was brought in from Canada, and they interviewed the flight refuelers at Gander and other people, because but at the end of the day, they couldn't really determine. They thought initially that piece of cork might have been placed in the fuel line at Gander. But after all their interviews, they couldn't really determine where that piece of cork originated. It could have been put there in Montreal or some other place, but they never really did determine whether that was an intentional act. But that's the only story that I know of at Gander that's related to sabotage.
Okay. And the next question was, I understand that some of the ferry pilots were women. Do you have any information on that?
And this might be a bit confusing because ferry there were no female ferry pilots with Ferry Command. There was only one ferry pilot, Jackie Cochran, an American, did ferry over an aircraft in 1941. I think it was in July of 41, and it was a bit controversial among the men ferry pilots, and so she did handle some of the flying. Captain Carlisle, he did the landings and takeoffs, but he let her fly the aircraft over. And I guess, but that was the only instance where they, in the case of Ferry Command, and it was for publicity reasons. But now there were also there might be some confusion too, because in Great Britain there was what they call the Air Transport Auxiliary. In the Air Transport Auxiliary, there were many women ferry pilots there, but they ferried aircraft within the United Kingdom. And there was also the Women's Air Force service pilots in the United States, and they also ferried aircraft from the factories to locations in the United States. Some of those American ferry pilots did ferry bombers so far as Goose Bay, and they were intent on flying them overseas, but the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces intervened and unfortunately wouldn't let them go any further than Goose Bay. But in Ferry Command, there was Jackie Cochran who made that one flight, and there were a number of instances where there were some members of the Air Transport Auxiliary in the UK did fly with Ferry Command as supernumerary, I believe they're called, pilots. So just more as observers. If that answers the question.
And then the next question was there any consideration to island hopping via Greenland and Iceland?
Well, Greenland and Iceland were two key bases on the North Atlantic route. So there were, and that's why sort of where Goose Bay comes in, because Goose Bay, it was sort of the northern route included Goose Bay, and there were bases in Reykjavik, or sorry, so I'll go back to Greenland. And so there were bases in Greenland that were codenamed BW1, BW2, and then Reykjavik in Iceland. So they did use, when you flew the northern route, a lot of these aircraft that flew through Goose Bay, especially shorter range aircraft that couldn't fly nonstop across the Atlantic, they would take that northern route and go from Goose Bay to Greenland to Iceland and then on into Prestwick in Scotland.
Okay. And then Harold wants to know, what was the main role of the Hudson bomber in England and Europe?
Well, bombing, and I think the Hudsons in the UK were used, quite a few of them were used by the Royal Air Force Coastal Command, so for anti-submarine operations. Now, early in the war, I suspect they were used for bombing missions and over Germany. Well, I don't know. I think that most of them were used for the RAF Coastal Command. Right?
Okay. Oh, and Alan says, I would like to add that my father, Flying Officer Francis Corbett, flew aircraft from Gander to Scotland.
Yeah, and Frank Corbett, that's Frank Corbett was with the, and he was with is this the Frank Corbett that was with the flight operations at Gander? Was he a Ferry Command pilot, or was he, because there is Frank Corbett I do mention in my book, and he was with the flight operations at Gander, and he was involved in a few of the salvage operations as well.
He mentions that you had some correspondence, so
Yeah,
I guess you've spoken to him.
yeah, some years ago, I believe. Yeah, yeah, and he's mentioned in the book a few times too.
That's it for questions for the moment.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a question. I found it hard to find my unmute button there for some reason. So I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that Gander existed before the Second World War, because it had such a presence and importance and significance during the Second World War that we kind of gravitate to that period. So I'm just wondering what was it about Gander that it was chosen for these airfields before the Second World War? I guess maybe the topography, perhaps?
Well, being there were a number of reasons, of course. Well, that location in Newfoundland, especially that geographically, it was a plateau, and that area of the island was said to be one of the more fog-free areas of the island. They did consult with meteorologists and government officials here, and a gentleman who was involved with the Newfoundland Railway, and even Douglas Fraser, one of our pioneer pilots, they all suggested that particular area in Newfoundland had some of the best weather. So the location at Gander was convenient because it was a relatively flat plateau. It was convenient because it was next to the Newfoundland Railway, and it was also convenient because Gander Lake was adjacent, and Gander Lake, they believe, could be used as an alternate landing site to Botwood. So if Botwood was closed in because of weather, they could use Gander. And in fact, they did use Gander. And there was an area called Glen Eagles on Gander Lake down near Appleton. If anyone knows Gander, Appleton and Glenwood. But there was a spot down there called Glen Eagles where they did establish before the Second World War, that they did set up a small, an alternate landing site there, and there was a guest house there and a wireless operation. So they had a sort of a mini sort of airport, I guess you could say. But if that answers your question.
It does, yeah. And just a spin-off from that, I've come across the reference to Botwood a lot. So what was the significance of Botwood during the Second World War?
Botwood, well, as I mentioned, Botwood was used for the experimental flying boat transatlantic flights in the 1930s, in the late 1930s. And these experimental flights, I mentioned Imperial Airways, but the Americans were also involved as well. And they flew. There were reciprocal landing rights. It was a bit of a complicated period, but Botwood continued to be used throughout the Second World War until it closed out in 1945. Botwood was used, well, during the war, it was used by the RCAF, had aircraft stationed there, amphibious aircraft for anti-submarine patrols. But these flying boats continued to use Botwood. Again, like say Imperial Airways and what's the other one? American Export Airlines, and there were a bunch of flying boats that continued to use Botwood during the war. But of course, there was no passenger service during the war, so all these flying boats going through Botwood were under most of them were under war contracts for the UK or the American governments, and they were just, if their passengers were mostly VIPs, officers and high-ranking officers and that sort of thing. But there was no passenger service, but there were still a lot of flights went through Botwood.
Perfect, thank you. I always wondered about that.
Right, and Joan has her hand up for a question.
Hi, Daryl, a beautiful job on the lecture and on your book too.
Thank you.
You can hear me good. I wonder if you ever came across any mention of Joe Gilmore, who's I think from Belfast, maybe.
Yeah.
And ever meeting up with Sir Hugh Tudor, who lived in Newfoundland, you know, and had been head of the
Yeah.
Black Hands. Is there any?
And no, when was he? But he was here.
He was
Joe
here
Tudor, when was he here?
from the 20s till he died in
Okay.
65.
I know. I will have to say no. I come across nothing of that nature. No. And
Okay.
now it's a question like Joe Gilmore's son. Maybe it's a question I can ask him. He might know.
Oh, right. Oh,
I can check.
Good.
Yep.
Yep. Thank you. Great.
Right. And incidentally, Joe Gilmore. Well, I think you might. I don't know if you read my book. So yeah, he did get himself in a bit of trouble. I think helping a wounded member of the IRA, and he got back in the early 20s, helping a wounded member of the IRA cross over into the Irish Free State, I believe. And Joe Gilmore got arrested for it. So interesting character.
It is very humane of him if he was more on the British side.
Okay, and if Gus Harris wants to say anything, he can unmute himself.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, friendship, and like I said, I'm making it clear to him, friendship. That's it, just friendship. And I think that, I mean, he's 77. That's probably. So I said to him, well, and Alan, I said, you know, where you work? He works part. See, what he did for a living, he was a general manager for all the Atlantic grocery stores. That's what he did for a living. And so when he
I
retired,
think we
Costco wanted him
probably mute
to
Gus and
work part-time for
somebody
managing
let
that.
him know that he has an opportunity to speak if he would like to. Because somebody was in the background there speaking without knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear
Yes.
you now.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Good, Jan.
And Jack Harris of the Newfoundland Pony Society, it looks like, also has something to say.
Okay.
So he can unmute himself.
Yes, Daryl, I just want to know, do you know anything about Ted Henley, who was joined the RAF in 1939? He was from St. John's. It happens to be an uncle of mine. But he was with Ferry Command, later with Bomber Command in the UK, and later served in Gander as I believe it was BOAC at the airport. And he was, just to know, this evening, was a source for Frank Thibault about the Banting crash. Do you know much about him or what he was doing there?
No, I had to be honest. I'm certainly familiar with his name, but you say he was with Ferry Command?
Well, he served in Ferry Command. Now, whether he was a pilot, and he was a bomber pilot with the RAF in the UK during the war. But he started off with Ferry Command, and that's all I know. I don't know a lot of the detail. But you mentioned Gordon Pinsent a little earlier. He was also in the movie The Rowdyman as the policeman.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm certainly I'm familiar with his name, but again, I'm intrigued because whenever again, I've got the picture up there of some of the Newfoundlanders that served in the Ferry Command. And
yes, I don't recognize him there.
no, he's not there because I didn't realize that he flew with Ferry Command. So, but now I'm intrigued to add him to my list, and I do have a contact with the Department of National Defense in Ottawa at their historical archives, and I'll bounce his name off them because they have a lot of these what they call crew assignment cards or crew employment cards, and they were the actual cards that were kept during the Second World War. Unfortunately, they were kept and they weren't destroyed, and they're basically in the archives now, D&D's archives, and these cards actually, they'll show the air crew, could be a pilot or a navigator, and they will list every flight that they took and where they went to and that. So I'll have to send his name off, see what I can find out.
That'd be great. Listen, I also am intrigued in that the story normally told about Gander Airport was that the Canadians were searching for a good place and all of that sort of stuff, but the airport was already there, obviously, from your story, and I'm interested in hearing that. That's news to me.
Yeah, well, well, it was very fortuitous, no doubt, because I mean, it just with Ferry Command and just really fortunate that the airport was there for a number of reasons, not just for Ferry Command, but also as a location for anti-submarine aircraft with the RCAF, and then for American ferrying operations as well. So, yeah, very fortuitous.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And Lynette Murphy would like to know if you know when the Queen visited Gander.
Well, it wasn't during the Second World War. When did she visit Gander? She visited well, she was there for the official opening of the terminal in 1959. But whether she visited before then, and maybe there might be someone else listening here from Gander who could probably give that answer. But I think she visited for the opening of the current terminal in 59. And she was probably here. I'm not sure. That's the only date that comes to mind. And as Botwood too mentioned, Heidi talked about Botwood. I mean, there were some, these flights that went through there, and you probably know Sir Winston Churchill went through there as well, right? And many other dignitaries.
All right. And Robert would like to know if you know what caused the Banting crash.
Well, that's a long question, long answer to that question. But the Court of Inquiry really determined that it was, they assumed it to be ice buildup, ice accretion, and ice buildup, and it's it wasn't considered. There was nothing in and I know that there are lots of stories of conspiracy theory stories and sabotage and this sort of thing, but there are a lot of non-believers out there that won't believe me, but there's no evidence. I've never seen any solid evidence to suggest that it was sabotage. Everything seems to points to mechanical failure, and there is documentation that certainly it lays out exactly technically what happened there with a broken adjuster ring in the thermostatic unit, and that's what they said. But I'm not an aircraft mechanic, so I can't really explain that. But it was considered mostly to be engine failure and due to ice accretion and ice buildup.
That's all the questions we have at the moment. If anyone else would like to,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, John.
Yep.
All right. Oh, and someone has said, as an aside, in 1941, Richard Adelson, who composed the Warsaw Concerto, stopped at Gander on his way to Hollywood to record his composition for the movie. While in Gander, he put on a concert, and it was the first place and time that the composition was played in North America.
Yeah, who was that again?
That was Richard Adelson.
Okay.
Oh, and we have an answer. The Queen was here in 53.
53. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I noticed Paul Shea emailed a question earlier about clearing of the airport area by loggers, and I'm not sure what that is in reference to. And if Paul is still online, if you'd want to unmute himself and ask his question. Or Daryl, do you know what that is in reference to?
Clearing of the, not really, no. I mean, when they
By
built
loggers.
yeah. Well, I mean, when they went in, they clear. Yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, when they built the airport, when they started the clearing of the airport in 1936, I mean, they went in and they would have cut down trees and cleared, brought in bulldozers and so on, right? But whether the logs were, they hired loggers to go in there, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not really sure the context of the question there.
Okay. Can anybody hear me now? No.
Yeah, I can.
You can. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I can see that Gus Harris has his video on, but Gus is 99 years old, so I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Can Leah unmute him, or does he have to do it himself?
He has to do it himself.
He has to unmute himself. So,
yes.
So Gus, if you can unmute yourself, or if there's somebody there with you who can take you off mute, we'd love to hear from you. If you can't do it yourself, if there's somebody else close to you who can unmute you, that would be great. We'd love to hear from you. I will say what
tell them how, John.
What?
Tell them how.
Gus, what you have to do is you have to put the cursor down to the bottom of your screen, and it should show you over on the left-hand side a microphone with a stroke through it, and you have to put the cursor over the stroke and click on it, and you should be able to take yourself off mute.
I think he's got it.
Has he got it?
I think so.
Gus, go ahead.
Go ahead, what?
Yeah, you're on. Gus, what you wanted to make a comment?
A very interesting presentation.
The whole root of the thing, Sharon, I think, is that she was.
It substantiated my belief in the number of
I think that's.
aircraft that were delivered to the United Kingdom,
But there's nothing that.
something about 7,000. Most of them, I imagine, were Hudsons. Great job all those pilots and crews did to help Britain in those days.
And Gus, you were a part of those crews, Gus, is that correct?
I beg your pardon?
Were you were a crew member? You were with Ferry Command, I understand?
I was what?
Were you with Ferry Command?
Oh, yes.
Yes, tell me a little bit about your time with Ferry Command.
Well, all I can say, I was there 4 years with Ferry Command after graduation. And I spent about half of my time on the South Atlantic route to Africa, through Ascension Island, and other transfers of aircraft to the Middle East and to Australia and New Zealand.
Gus, I noticed that your number had a New Zealand beginning. It began with NZ. So are you from New Zealand, or did you join up in New Zealand?
Yes, I was born in New Zealand. I joined up in New Zealand in 42. I trained in Canada as a navigator and was posted to the RAF command at the end of 1942 in Dorval.
That's terrific. So were you a North Islander or a South
Excellent.
Islander? In New
North.
Zealand?
I was a North Islander.
A Wellington guy?
No, North, I would be Auckland side.
The Auckland side, good.
Correct, right.
Yeah.
So Gus, did you fly through Gander?
Go ahead, Daryl, sorry.
I just wanted, Gus, did you fly through Gander on the North Atlantic route?
Gander on the north route, yes, from, we used to pick up B-24s in Dorval, fly to Gander. We rested there for 10 or 12 hours, and we departed Gander usually 11 to 12 o'clock at night for the Azores, Morocco, and the Middle East.
They were long flights.
They were long flights. They were very flights.
So what was your destination? Was your destination Morocco, or was it somewhere else in the Middle East?
Cairo.
Cairo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Right.
And did you see the pyramids?
I beg your pardon?
Did you see the pyramids?
Oh, yes. I not only saw the pyramid, I climbed up the pyramids.
Good. And did you sail on the Nile? Did you sail on the Nile?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, it's wonderful to have you at this lecture. This is a really high point, I think. And Daryl can't wait to go visit you.
Yeah, and I was just lucky I was one of the survivors and that I've lived this long. And now I'm my 99th year.
So when's your birthday?
September.
Okay, well,
Coming up, I'll be 100 in September.
Good, you're going to get the happy telegram from the Queen.
Yeah, thank you. I hope we do. I'm in good health, although I have to use a walker to get around the house.
Well, you sound very strong.
Mhm.
Thank you. Mhm.
I'd love to have a chat with you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, are there any
And,
other? Go ahead.
Yes, Peter Neary has his hand up.
Oh, okay, Peter.
What was that?
Oh, Peter Neary is going to speak now, so we're going to put you back on mute. Can you do that, Leah, so he doesn't have to
Yeah.
bother with it? Okay.
There you go.
Okay, Daryl, thank you very much, first of all, for a most informative lecture. I think everybody would have learned much from your presentation this evening. Could you say something about the Commonwealth Forces Cemetery at present-day Gander, which I know dates from the war period, and which is most unusual in Newfoundland or in Canada for that matter?
Mhm. Anything in particular you're wondering about the cemetery, or?
I was wondering about the origins of the cemetery. I noticed when I've been there how international the graves are in the cemetery.
Yeah, the cemetery at Gander was established after a well, it wasn't the first, because some of the first fatalities at Gander was the Banting crash, but of course Banting was returned to Toronto, and the two deceased air crew were brought to Nova Scotia. But the cemetery at Gander was established after a serious crash of an RCAF aircraft in which six crewmen were killed very near the airfield. And that was in July of 41. And it was then when they decided to establish the cemetery. And the site was selected by the Canadian Minister or Deputy Minister of Defense, I believe it was, who was visiting at the time, and a gentleman by the name of Harold Pattison. And he was basically he was the airport manager at this time the RCF had taken over, but Pattison was basically the Newfoundland government air representative. And you know who Pattison is, I know that, but he was the Newfoundland government air representative, and it was him and the DND deputy minister, I believe it was, selected the site in 1941. So yeah, that was a site for burials for RAF, Ferry Command, RCAF, and the American military forces were buried there as well. I think, and I had a number here, I know I did write it down, but I think there was about 24, so there's about 100 service personnel buried at Gander Cemetery. 24 of those are Ferry Command, and the balance are mostly Canadian, or are Canadian or British. And there's quite a few that were buried there that were killed in the Knights of Columbus fire as well. And the American, so the cemetery was also shared with the Americans, but of course there were about 55 Americans buried there. Most of those were, again, service personnel who were killed in aircraft crashes around the airfield, ferrying their aircraft overseas. And of course, if you go to the Gander Cemetery today, there's like I said, there's 100 buried there, but there were about closer to, well, it was just over 150 at the end of World War II. Of course, the American policy then, after the war, as it is now, they repatriated the remains of American servicemen. So in 1947, actually in 1945, all the Americans who were buried at Gander, their remains were reburied at the Post Cemetery at Fort Pepperell here in St. John's. And then in 1947, all the American casualties, American burials in Newfoundland and in Labrador were all returned to the United States. They were basically taken aboard a ship. It was a transport ship that Joseph V. Connolly, I believe it was, and all the American casualties in Newfoundland were placed aboard the ship and returned to the United States to either buried in family cemeteries or community cemeteries or at national cemeteries. It was really up to the family's discretion where they wanted their loved ones buried. So Gander, if you see Gander, you go to Gander today and you see the Gander there's 100 service personnel buried there, but actually at the end of World War II, there was a little over 150, counting the Americans.
I would just on that point, Daryl, there's a very interesting cemetery in Goose Bay, and it's a cemetery
Yeah.
where a significant number of military personnel were buried. We always assumed it was as a result of crash sites in and around Goose Bay during the war. But in that cemetery too, though, is a significant number of children's burials. And we have certain theories about how that happened, but it's an interesting juxtaposition. And every year there's it's part of the memorial service that goes on there.
And they actually, the Canadians and the RAF discontinued using Gander Cemetery in early 1944. The Americans continued to use it up until war's end.
Yeah.
But the Canadians and the RAF discontinued using the cemetery in 1944. In fact, so there were a number of casualties, Ferry Command and RCAF, that are buried at the Mount Pleasant Cemetery here in St. John's, the Joint Service Cemetery. So they discontinued using, the Canadians and the RAF did anyway, discontinued using Gander, because there was some thought that they actually, they might, at war's end, they might actually disinter all those, all those deceased at Gander and move them elsewhere. But of course they didn't, obviously they didn't do that. But
Okay.
But that was a consideration at the time in 1944, because the thought was, that I guess they didn't know what the future held for the airfield, but so they discontinued using Gander and used the Joint Services Cemetery here in St. John's.
Okay.
All right, we just have one last comment or question from Lynette.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Paul Murphy. My dad is John Murphy, who you've mentioned in the book. And sitting next to me is my mom, Jean, who came to Gander in late 1947 or early 48, and has a story to tell about your photo of the terminal with a building within a building, or working at that counter.
Yeah.
That was my career in Gander, working for KLM, and it was. I remember a lot, but all I remember is at one point when I'm checking passengers back on the flights, I was late getting from the ticket counter to the gateway. So I did something that doesn't usually happen. I squished up on the counter and then dropped down into the terminal and said to the passengers, "Follow me." And I checked them all out. It was, but my original inquiry about Queen Elizabeth was that when she came to open the Gander
Terminal.
The terminal, yes. Then that is when I met the Queen of England. And it's a long time ago, but I do remember wearing my white gloves and my white hat because she was the Queen of England. But Darryl, you've done a wonderful job. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I corresponded with John on a pretty regular basis, and when he a few times when he came here from Arizona, we got together for a coffee and had a chat. So
he mentioned, yes,
yes,
probably at Tim Hortons with the donut.
yeah, probably so. Yeah, and of course he's mentioned regularly in my book as well, right? He's one of my key characters. Of course, you saw a picture of him earlier. Yeah, wonderful
Once
man.
again, thank you very much. That was a good presentation.
Well, thank you, much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to thank Darryl Hillier for his presentation. I'm sure you will all join with me in thanking him for what he's provided to us tonight and the perspective he brings to this subject. And I remind you that one of the best ways to thank him, of course, is to buy his book. And all you have to do is to go to his website that I mentioned earlier, or even if you Google his name, it'll probably come up. So we look forward to hearing more from you, Daryl, in the future. So that really brings an end to our Zoom meeting tonight. And while this is the end of the presentation, I'd ask that Daryl Hillier remain on the Zoom meeting so that he and a number of board members and myself can do a little debriefing of this evening. So I want to thank everybody for participating in the event. We look forward to seeing you next month when Michelle Joe and Sheila O'Neill will deliver a presentation on their new book, My Indian. So good night, everybody.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Bye-bye.